All right, we are live. And while I wait for people to start coming in, I saw that there were some in the queue. I wanted to start off by saying, hello, Brad Schreiber.
Eric Hundley, it is always good to talk with you. I've been looking forward to this.
Well, now what would I describe you? I say psychotically eclectic author. Do I just stick with that?
I think I better change that, or people are going to recommend that I be put in a rubber room. And author, actor, producer, literary consultant. How about that?
Okay. So do you help people with ghostwriting and that sort of thing? Or
Yes, sometimes it's ghosting, sometimes it's co-writing, sometimes it's editing. I wish I could announce it now, Eric, but I'm in the middle of a negotiation to co-write a book with a former New York Times #1 best-selling author who's in law enforcement, something that you know a lot about.
well, then maybe I can get an exclusive off it if it comes through.
Yeah, it looks really good. Basically, he's approved of me. His manager's approved of me. His agent's approved of me. The publisher, I don't know what his wife thinks of me, but it looks pretty good.
Well, actually, his wife's opinion may really matter because God only knows how much time you spend together.
Yeah.
Now, you're in the LA area, right?
That's right. I'm in Studio City, and we were awakened at 4:30 this morning by an earthquake. And there looks like there's a fire outside. So it's pretty much in keeping with a COVID-19 Trump era, I think.
Well, perfect. Now, to roll into the show, as people come in, you've seen the live stream before, so you know that I'm seeking questions from the audience to ask you. And then, of course, I'll hijack time and ask you questions of my own.
Right.
So I want to kind of get rolling with what the thesis is because I sort of tease people about it. And you and I talked about it before about doing an interview, and it's essentially criminals and revolutionaries. Because I have a strange thesis that they're not that far apart, that there seems to be kind of a crossover between some of these folks. Like, I threw it out there to the crowd, but Charles Manson, Donald DeFreeze, and John Lennon.
Right. People I've written about. Music is Power, my book about the history of sociopolitical music, is taken a deep dive into the Beatles and then separated them from John Lennon, who really changed his attitude in songwriting and his political motivations after he left the Beatles. And of course, you mentioned Donald DeFreeze, so that's Revolution's End, the book I wrote about the hidden history of the Patty Hearst kidnapping and the formation of Symbionese Liberation Army. I know that you and I talked about DeFreeze before.
We did.
And I have a bit of sympathy for him. After all, he did rob a bank and did fire at people on the street. But when you get into where he came from and the pressures on him and his desperately becoming an informant just to survive the LAPD, I at least developed a lot more sympathy for him.
Okay, well, I had some questions come in from the community that I wanted to ask you ahead of time. Some of them may be almost non sequiturs, I'm not sure. But you did the Manson tour and still do.
Esotouric, the award-winning bus tour company in LA, even though, we're in the middle of the pandemic, they're going to reopen. We may well start doing online webinars as well. But yes, I've done, I don't know, about 3 years of sold out bus tours about Manson in LA.
Yeah, you should do one. Have somebody follow you around with a DSLR and just do the tour and film you doing the tour, because you can keep 6 feet apart and go to the different locations, talk it out, and put it up on YouTube or somewhere.
Yeah, I'm one of those bizarre people who doesn't defend Manson's behavior, but is willing to look into a really disturbing childhood that basically shaped him as a criminal. And he was also fairly intelligent and fairly manipulative. And sometimes you can listen to Charles Manson talk in those clips, and if you didn't know who he was, he'd seem fairly rational. And then you'd find out, oh, wait a second now, this is what the guy has been doing. He also lost control of his own family, which is something I talk about in the tour. And someone like Tex Watson, who blew up a number of drug deals and became violent, shapes the narrative of Manson. Manson wasn't present at the murders, but he utilized someone who lost control and was a murderer. So you can't have a lot of sympathy for him unless you understand where Manson came from.
Okay, well, the first question I had coming in from the side is from a friend of mine, Andrew Meinzer, who actually talks quite a bit in the Instructor group. And essentially,
hello, Andrew.
I'm going to put it up on the screen, but is there any truth to the conspiracy theories that I've heard about him being experimented on with LSD by the CIA?
There's a gentleman named Tom O'Neill who spent 20 years writing about Manson. And I read his book when it was in galleys because I was so excited to see where it went. And I have every sympathy for Tom O'Neill, who basically spent so much money on research that the money he made basically evaporated.
Was that the PI or is that somebody else?
No. Tom suggested in his book on Manson, a pretty recent book, that there might have been a CIA MK Ultra connection, which of course fascinated me because Donald DeFreeze of the SLA was right in the middle of that at Vacaville prison and the CIA drug experimentations on black prisoners.
And Kaczynski was MK.
And Kaczynski is also exactly connected to that through Harvard, which we should talk about a little bit. And
we will.
We can talk about Tim Leary a little bit more. And I'm a little leery about Leary's origins. but that said, Tom O'Neill made the point that Dr. David Smith at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic had a relationship with the CIA where he basically told them about the use of, or the overuse of LSD in the community, which everyone knows about, the Summer of Love and all the drugs and the homelessness and the criminality that were sometimes fueled by not only naivete, but by drugs. Mm. And the fact of the matter is that Manson used to go to the same clinic. Actually, Abigail Folger, who was murdered on Cielo Drive with Tate and the others, Abigail Folger had been a volunteer for the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic.
Really? Did they know each other? Or can that be proven?
I've read some stuff that said that Manson approached Folger and asked her for money because, you know, the Folger coffee fortune. Mm-hmm. She was a trust fund kid and she had a lot of extra money to spend. She turned him down when she actually interacted with him in San Francisco.
But I thought it was Terry Melcher that was the real cause of their hitting that house.
No, that's actually a misnomer. The fact of the matter is Melcher has gone on record in Rolling Stone and said that Manson had visited the Cielo Drive house after Melcher moved out. So Manson knew that Melcher was no longer there. And I can get into that, but I just want to make this sort of closure on Tom O'Neill.
Sure.
Tom O'Neill came up with some really fascinating information and he expanded the knowledge base on Manson. But to my mind, he did not make a connection that was convincing about Charles Manson cooperating with the CIA or being a victim of MK Ultra. I don't believe that that's so. It's fascinating to think about, but when you get into the blown drug deals and the mafiosi that Manson knew, both in prison and in Los Angeles, and there was an FBI surveillance based on the mob stealing securities from airports around the country. And while the FBI was surveilling some of these sketchy mafia guys, he coincided with the Tate household where drugs were being sold regularly. In fact, Sharon Tate and her friends knew some of the people in the Manson family. Not that they would hang out with them normally socially, but they bought drugs from them. That's how prevalent drug use was in Hollywood in the late 60s.
So it was a smaller town, so to speak. It wasn't only the music connection. There were other connections tying.
Well, absolutely. I don't think Tex Watson, who introduced Manson to Sharon Tate and a number of other people, Wojtek Frykowski, and others who were victims at Cielo Drive, I don't think they would have given these people the time of day. They all seemed like quote unquote burnout hippies living in the desert. But the fact is that they could sell drugs to, well, Wojtek Frykowski and Jay Sebring, two of the victims. Jay Sebring, by the way, being a former lover of Sharon's. He was known as the Candy Man. He sold more cocaine to stars than anyone in Hollywood. And
wasn't that Warren Beatty movie based on him slightly?
Shampoo was a
Shampoo. That's it. Sorry.
Yeah, it was an amalgamation, actually, Eric, of a number of characters, actually existing hairstylists, and a little bit of two or three people. But I guess what I'm trying to say here is that Sharon Tate and her friends interacted with the Manson family before the killings because they were drug dealers, and Frykowski and Sebring were drug dealers and went back and forth. Otherwise, I don't think they would have socialized with them. They tended to socialize with people in the industry, musicians and actors and other people in TV and film.
Has that been out there before, that he knew them beforehand? Because everything I've ever seen has implied that that was the first encounter. And obviously Manson wasn't there at the time, but and I know that a lot of this goes to Vincent Bugliosi, who made his bones on that case.
Well, part of the problem is that Bugliosi basically was not a reliable spokesperson. He actually was brought up on charges of prosecutorial misconduct when he leaked information illegally to an LA Herald Examiner reporter named William Farr. He could have been disbarred. He could have been thrown in jail for what he did. And he actually convinced Evel Younger, who then was the head of the DA's office, to go around the man who was actually handling the case. Bugliosi was like second chair. He'd been in the DA's office maybe 2 years. And he went to Evel Younger and said, this is not a series of drug burns that went wrong. This is about crazed hippies who are basically under the control of a Svengali, Charles Manson. And
kind of Rasputin. I mean, he really, I feel like he sort of made Manson seem like Rasputin. Is that
he did. And one of the things I talk about on the tour of Manson, Eric, is why Bugliosi made this contention, which was absolutely non-factual, that basically these people were zombies under control. In fact, Linda Kasabian and Tex Watson did drug deals on their own without telling Manson. The reason it was okay with Manson was because the money came back to the family out in the desert. So he basically gave Kasabian, who was formerly one of the biggest LSD dealers in Boston, they didn't mention that at the trial, and Tex Watson, carte blanche to cut whatever deals they could and then bring back money so that Manson and his family could continue to survive, because they obviously had no influx of money. These are all things that Bugliosi manipulated because he absolutely wanted to make sure, and your audience will think, what's wrong with it? He wanted to make sure that Manson got the death penalty. The death penalty still existed in California at that time. One of the things I also mentioned on the tour is that if Charles Manson, who did not kill anybody and was not present when people were killed, had actually been charged for crimes in 1969, it would have been accessory to murder. And at that time, the maximum penalty would have been 18 months. Can you imagine how the world would have reacted and how it would have impacted Bugliosi's career and Younger's career if these other people got a death penalty and Charles Manson, the leader, got 18 months? Even if you tacked on other sentences regarding sex with underage girls and stolen car parts, it still wouldn't have been a capital crime. And there was no way that Bugliosi and Younger were going to sign off on that. So they had to find ways to make him the Svengali.
Well, I always thought Manson was kind of a wimp in actuality. Like Watson, from what I understand, he barely had control over him, and Watson could turn on him and take him out himself pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's true that that was a very questionable power relationship. And sometimes Tex Watson stayed with the family, sometimes he stayed on his own. Manson always made all the women stay out in the desert, but Watson was kind of a free agent, so to speak. You know, Manson is a wimp. Well, again, not to give him too much pity and too much understanding and a pat on the back, but
Mhm.
you know, his father disappeared. His mother was a prostitute. He went to a boys' school where he was a reformatory where he was raped. He then became a rapist. He went to jail. He was short in stature, and the only way that he figured he could stay alive in prison was to act crazy amongst other convicts. And also, interestingly, when he was at McNeil Island in Washington, he started befriending mafia members.
Mm.
Alvin Creepy Carpus, who used
Great
to,
name.
yeah, isn't it? And they spell it Kreepy, which I love. They perfectly spelled it. Well, he was public enemy number one back in the early days of J. Edgar Hoover. And a guy named Frankie Carbo, who interestingly had a relationship with Lino LaBianca as well.
Mm.
Manson's psychology was such that he felt safe. He felt he learned from mafioso people in jail. And he also felt safe because they had a code of behavior, which is very strange. So when he was out in Los Angeles before he formed the family, he had relationships with members of the mafia who would say, "Oh, you want to sell drugs here at this
Here are
club
the
on Sunset
rules.
Boulevard? We take our cut, and this is our cut, and as long as you pay us, we got no problem with you." And Manson sort of relied on a steady income from mob members, and it was when he started rubbing shoulders with people like Tex Watson that things started getting out of control.
Okay, interesting. Here's another one that came in from the community page.
Mm-hmm.
And it's essentially, how many people do you think Manson and his family killed that didn't get charged with? And from what I've read, I think this is Bill Barry. From what I've read and heard, that dude was a cold-blooded killer, and I have a feeling they killed a lot of people. That's not here.
To
Do you
this
have any
day,
speculation?
well, there was a fellow who was a stagehand at the ranch named Shorty Shea, who was disappeared and died. There was no real trial about Shorty Shea. There was no guilt found in his death. So no one knows who killed him. If Manson ordered anyone killed, it might well have been Shorty Shea, but I don't think we'll ever know.
Okay.
Certainly, Gary Hinman, who died in Topanga Canyon, who was making mescaline, again, all these disagreements around drugs.
Mhm.
Manson did go out to the house and he cut him with a sword, but then he left him with one of the members of the family and said, you know, fix him up, stitch him up because his ear had been cut very severely, and bring him back to the ranch and we'll interrogate him. The reason, parenthetically, was the Manson family claimed that some mescaline they bought from Gary Hinman was bad, and the people who had deleterious effects from it were Hell's Angels, who were then leaning on Charlie Manson to make good. So you can see how Manson was angry. Hinman claimed that he was being ripped off, and Manson was not present when he was killed. So if Manson actually ordered any killings purposely, it may well have been Shorty Shea.
Okay. And question in here: does LSD change the chemical configuration of the brain? Now, you're rarely possibly able to answer this because you've done all of your autopsy series. So I know you've studied a little bit, even though I know you're not going to say you're a doctor or anything.
I'm not a doctor, but I've taken LSD. How's that?
That answers it. Yes, it changes the brain.
Right now, I'm not on LSD now. I just want to confirm that for your audience in case they start doubting my word.
They said, kind of the way meth does, to continue.
Well, it doesn't permanently change the nature, as I understand it, of the makeup of the cells of the brain. The interesting thing is LSD, I can tell you from way back when I experimented with it briefly, it does take a while to recover from it. You're not going to be up and at 'em the next morning drinking coffee and hitting the day and all of your appointments. It really has a draining effect. But one thing that people don't recognize is that back in the time of Manson, people took really strong dosage of LSD. They took 250, 500 micrograms. Now, psychotherapists are using micro dosages of LSD, 20, 25, micrograms.
For PTSD.
And once or twice, under the guidance of a psychologist, in order to deal with post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's been amazingly effective. But a drug that powerful, taken too many times, then you worry about the dosage. Is it pure? Is it cut? What's the environment? The environment shapes the experience on the drug. If there's too much stimuli or loudness, it really has a negative effect on the taker. All these things affect the trip that you take. And my attitude is, if you wanted to experiment back in the day with that drug, you did a small dosage, you made sure it was pure, you were in a very placid setting, and you didn't do it regularly.
Like Sid Barrett would be maybe the poster child for overindulging.
Thank you. There's a call out to Music is Power, my book. And when I wrote Pink Floyd, Sid Barrett, who founded Pink Floyd, and wrote really charming little English ditties, completely different from what Pink Floyd inevitably did with The Wall and Dark Side of the Moon.
But yet it was influenced because it was written about him. So he kind of runs through the band. When they found their own voice, a lot of it was shaped by dealing with the madness of their former friend.
Absolutely. Wish You Were Here and so many other songs, Comfortably Numb. There are many others. But to address your point, Eric, Sid Barrett stayed at a very famous commune, you might call it, in London called 101 Cromwell Street. Donovan had actually written a song that was about it. And, Allen Ginsberg and a lot of these other counterculture figures would hang out there. The problem is that managers of Pink Floyd would go over there and some of the members would say, oh, Sid's not talking to you because, we put some more LSD in his coffee this morning and he's been high 3 days in a row. Right. So whether Sid Barrett had schizophrenia, by the way, he was actually never examined by a doctor for mental disorder. So we don't know if he was just prone to something and LSD sent him over, or if the LSD exacerbated and created this psychological disorder. But literally he wound up unable to perform or even communicate. And the irony that I talk about in Music is Power is that Roger Waters and David Gilmour and the rest of the guys, as tragic as that loss was, it gave them an opportunity to talk about alienation, madness, the power of the state, and really important themes that Sid Barrett had no interest in whatsoever.
No, he had a childlike demeanor, I think, even before the drugs went crazy. He was known as being very playful, almost childlike.
Absolutely.
It's such an interesting dichotomy, too, because Sid / Roger Barrett, I believe, was taught a lot of guitar from Gilmour.
Yeah, he actually knew Waters
they grew up
around Oxford. And, if you write a hit song, Eric, about somebody stealing women's knickers off of a clothesline, that tells you the kind of stuff, Arnold Lane was just a really quirky little fun song. He was a great performer, apparently.
Charming transvestite. Think about it for a minute.
That's an excellent name for a band. The Charming Transvestites. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Sid Barrett was very charming, but he didn't actually want to be successful. He loved playing the UFO Club and the
Sure.
Marquee, and a very tight coterie of fans. When the group started being successful, he didn't really know how to deal with it. An interesting question psychologically is, did he go to 101 Cromwell Road and start doing lots of LSD because he didn't know how to deal with the idea of being a major pop star? That's a
Well,
question.
they were quick. I mean, he became a major pop star like within 3 months. It was a really accelerated time scale by everything I read.
London. In London, Pink Floyd just became unbelievably successful.
Mhm.
But if you look at the world domination of the group, that is something that even if he wasn't on acid, Sid Barrett would have had trouble dealing with. He did not like large crowds.
Well, unfortunately, that one is really Waters and Gilmore and the conflict between them. Because while he was big in England and famous, and I do think a lot of it might have been people just indulging him. Like, here you go, Sid. Here you go, Sid. The hangers-on who probably came about.
Yeah.
I don't know that he had the ability to take him to that level. I just don't feel like he had Gilmore's talent, if that makes sense.
I agree with you. We're talking about, criminals and revolutionaries. And sometimes criminals are revolutionaries. And sometimes revolutionaries are treated as criminals, like with John Lennon.
That's kind of where I was going.
Yeah, it's very natural segue, Eric. I mean, John Scheinfeld is a pal of mine, and I interviewed him for Music is Power. He did the documentary, The U.S. versus John Lennon. And boy, he's the go-to guy. He understands that Lennon palling around with Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman and the Yippies, who were trying to levitate the Pentagon, and John Lennon's, being pals with the Black Panthers. John Sinclair, the founder of the White Panthers. A lot of people don't know this, but John Lennon did a Michigan-wide, just for the state of Michigan, a Michigan-wide, 12-hour benefit concert to get John Sinclair out of jail. He was busted for having 3 or 4 joints of marijuana, and he was given this onerous sentence. And John Lennon had this huge benefit concert that brought in so much money. I still can't believe this, but I did the research and it's true. The weekend after that concert, the Michigan State Supreme Court threw out the conviction of John Sinclair based on the groundswell of response of John Lennon's benefit concert. So
what year was that?
Oh God, I'm terrible with years.
Range. I mean, was that still Beatles time or is that post Beatles?
Oh no, it's after John Lennon left the Beatles, and he's doing stuff with Yoko Ono, and he's palling around with the Yippies. So that's an interesting thing to consider when you look at John Lennon trying to be deported by the FBI, his own influence in the counterculture. And, let's get rid of him. Let's say that he had a conviction of marijuana in England, and on a technicality, let's throw the book at him and get rid of him. That was the attitude of Nixon and the AG and the FBI.
Yeah, there's so many weird crossovers. Like you mentioned John Lennon in Michigan, right? Another one you mentioned offhand earlier, but a lot of people don't quite realize, and I didn't realize this. Are you familiar with the book Astral Weeks by Ryan Walsh? And yes, it's named after the album by Van Morrison.
Yes, I'm more familiar with Van than I am the book.
Okay, well, fair enough. The book is what inspired, or the album is what inspired it, because Van Morrison recorded that in Boston. And everybody thought that the counterculture was all New York and San Francisco. And the thesis of this is 1968 was actually all Boston. And a lot of the counterculture, Timothy Leary, Harvard, MK Ultra. I forgot there was another cult who was the East Coast cult with a weird dude, Mel something or another, was the head of a cult that exists today.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know if you looked into all of that, because it's just utterly fascinating.
Yeah, there's so many interesting extensions, fringes of the early years of the LSD subculture, obviously starting with the CIA, who bought tens of thousands of hits. They basically bought up the world market of LSD from Sandoz Laboratories in Switzerland, which everybody knows. But, you're bringing up Harvard is really good because, Kaczynski was in basically a CIA-run behavioral experiment at Harvard. He was very brilliant, and he entered Harvard at, I believe it was 16. And there was a guy named Henry Murray, who basically, not unlike other scholars, other doctors, would cooperate with the CIA and derive money to conduct certain experiments. Some of the experiments would be medical, some would be psychological. In the case of Kaczynski, I think it led to Kaczynski basically fracturing mentally. That was the beginning of it, because I don't know why Kaczynski signed up for Henry Murray's, you might say, experiment, but it basically, for 2.5, 3 years at Harvard, Kaczynski was belittled and insulted by Henry Murray, being told that he wasn't very intelligent. And this already led to, more stress in a guy who basically had very few friends. He was incredibly bright. He was very shy. He had no socialization skills whatsoever.
His brother was bad too. That's one thing I found out, is if you really look at them both, they both have problems with social skills. So it wasn't just him. Right. And his brother was completely normal. His brother also was a little bit, I hate the term spectrum because it's lazy, but both of them weren't super great socially. So there may have been family issues and things of that sort.
And of course the irony there, Eric, is who's the guy who helped break the case? It was the brother who said, this sounds a lot like Ted meandering about, how the world has become too technological.
It's actually his sister-in-law.
It was his sister-in-law. I thought the brother was also involved.
Oh, he was. I think he called it, but I think his sister-in-law saw it when she was in France or something. And what was interesting is this is really early days of the internet. Yeah. And the FBI actually put up the manifesto online, and she looked at it, and I think it was, women can be extremely observant. And his queer turns of phrase, ironically, I interviewed Jim Fitzgerald, who was the guy who's a forensic linguist with the FBI.
Right.
Well, what tripped up Ted Kaczynski is perfection. He was the most perfect writer Fitzgerald's ever seen. He never made a mistake. And what kind of sank him was the term, you can't have your cake and eat it too. That's the way we say it now, right? He said, you can't eat your cake and have it.
He reversed it, and that stood out.
Right, but here's the funny part of it. We reversed it. The original saying is the way he said it from the 1600s. So he was so precise and perfect in language that it actually tripped him up. Yeah.
It's an incredible irony. So bad socialization, resentful about how he was treated. Then I don't know why he didn't drop out of that Harvard experiment. Perhaps he thought he would be thrown out of the school, but it didn't help him. It didn't help him one little bit. And by the time,
maybe it did, though. Maybe he felt like it did. I don't know how he felt at the time, but a lot of his manifesto and his feeling. I mean, he would be almost Amish with his mentality. He hates technology.
Well,
he hated anything modern, and maybe the LSD put him in touch with nature in his own peculiar way, and maybe he actually did like that. I don't know.
It's a good question. It may have been a sort of a confirmation bias sort of thing, where it's like, oh, I get it. These people, and Harvard people are so intellectual at Harvard, and they're going to belittle me. Well, guess what? I'll show them. It might have been an ego thing that went on to confirm how screwed up society was, and it might have just supported what wound up in that manifesto. Not only about technology, because frankly, we tried to talk to each other before, and I couldn't even, get my microphone to work. So sometimes I feel like a Luddite. But
sure, but you're not against it.
I'm not living in a cabin without rent. I like my comforts. I like my cable television,
Well, there's your irony for you. He actually lives in slightly bigger space now than he did.
Yeah.
And he has free access to a library and never has to worry about food.
And yet you and I were talking before we went live about how many people read that manifesto. It was unusual that they put it online, and it sounded very reasoned. It sounded, pretty well supported. So that
points, very valid points
of a guy who, bombed people. So what an interesting split. We expect our criminals and our madmen to be pretty much mad all the time. And I think there's nothing more frightening than the madman who says something that you go, oh, that's kind of true. I don't want to hear it from you.
Well, he had a lot of great points, and then there was that mailing bombs part that just took it too far.
Yeah, that kind of undercut his whole argument. But Manson was like that too, Eric, because the interview he did with Geraldo Rivera, which I show clips from, when we do the tours, at times he's talking in a veiled way about things that are true. He talked about the DA leaking information in order to railroad him, and that actually is correct. But then, he goes on a little bit more, and he goes crazy, and he talks in coded language. So, in the case of Manson, he not only was a little nuts, he was also afraid to tell all the truth, because you rat out people and you go back into jail, you're dead. And he understood that very well.
Well, in fairness, too, Nicole Simpson, most of the night was calm. There was just that few minutes where she was murdered along with Ron. So it's hard to tell. Obviously, we've got 24 hours a day, and people aren't always completely nuts, and broken clocks can't be right.
Yeah. Twice a day?
Minimum. But got some comments and questions I'm going to go ahead and run through here real quickly. Mixer 61. It took me 3 days to feel normal after a trip. This is from when we were talking about that. Yeah. That was in the late 70s and nowhere near the strength of the 60s stuff. I quite enjoyed it, actually. Lots of laughs and fun.
Again, it's very hard on your body. I'm not saying this as a point of pride, but when I was younger, I don't think people who didn't live in the late 60s and early 70s understand how prevalent drugs were of so many kinds. Street drugs that are not available anymore. You could buy peyote and mescaline, PCP. You could buy all kinds of things that you'd have to really dig to find. And sometimes people didn't get pure dosage, and it really messed them up. But again, back to the psychotherapeutic use of LSD. I'm proud to say that Tom Robbins, the novelist, gave me a blurb on my humor writing book, What Are You Laughing At? And I got to hang out with him once when I was teaching in Washington State, and he lives in Washington State, so I visited him in Alexa. And we got on the subject of the use of drugs to sort of further consciousness and not just, to have a thrill. And Robin said to me, my first LSD experience was my best because I spent hours watching a spider drink water on the ground. And first I laughed at the image, and then I asked him, so how did that inform you? And he said, I became very sympathetic to understanding that there's a multitude of life on the planet. And to study something in that much detail and have empathy for it, something you might normally step on, changes you forever. It changes your attitude about the world around you. And that's what happened with Tom Robbins. And his wonderful writing is very fun, and sometimes it's surrealistic. And so the good outcome of doing LSD is he became more sensitive to the idea of inanimate objects having personas and things like that, using dream imagery in your writing. But again, I'm glad that he didn't do it, once a week for 5 years, because
He wouldn't have his writing now.
Yeah, he wouldn't be writing anything now. He wouldn't have written all those great books because it's very, very intense stuff.
Now, I haven't had weed since I was a teenager, but I was just thinking to myself, it's kind of ironic because when I did have it was in the 80s, and it was more of catch as catch can, as you well know. So sometimes I'd get it and I just feel fun. It was, you giggle and mellow. Right. Other times you feel completely paranoid. And I've come to learn that there's the two strains. One's a Sinsemillion strain, and I forget the other. But essentially, the weed now has been genetically farmed to such a degree, so it's almost reverse the LSD. So while the LSD was so powerful in the 60s, the weed was really, really weak. The weed now is super powerful compared to that. Strange observation that they seem to.
Yeah, before we get to all the revolutionaries like Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman smoking weak marijuana, it's true. Of course, we're talking about micro dosages of LSD, so you're taking a smaller amount of what is pure.
More like shrooms. I've heard that they use shrooms quite a bit for PTSD as well, which I believe is supposed to be a little more mellow.
And, if people are interested seriously in exploring psychologically themselves, but doing it in a safe way, doing it, in an experiment that is condoned by, some institution is the way to go. The problem is that there was no way to be absolutely sure of the purity of drugs. And basically my first experience was in nature, and it was a beautiful experience. I was looking up at the stars and I felt like it was Van Gogh's painting of the Starry Night. And it felt beautiful and it felt spiritual. The next time I tried it, it wasn't pure. I also wasn't in, a beautiful location in Napa Valley. And I went, this is not going to be as good as it was. I don't think I want to do this anymore. And again, not only environment, but purity, attitude. Your mental attitude
going in,
you took those drugs, also determined the quality of the experience.
Yeah, having a fight with your significant other right beforehand is probably not a good way to go.
I don't know. Maybe you both take LSD and you work out your problems maritally.
Maybe
5 micrograms, not 250.
I would advise against it personally, just to be on the safe side.
I would. It was just, as I say, Eric, it was so prevalent. And it goes back to Sharon Tate and the LaBiancas. The LaBiancas were drug dealers as well. Most people don't know that.
Was that the mafia tie-in?
Frankie Carbo knew both Leno and Manson. And to not kind of spiral off too far, I'm merely suggesting that the Manson murders probably couldn't have happened in a different period, say the 80s, where you had this Reagan ethos of just say no, and it was much harder to get those drugs, and there was not as much variety of street drugs.
Wow, you're the first person I've ever heard who said that there was any kind of effect at all. I'm not gonna say if it's positive or negative, but
you mean effect?
That most of what I've read is that just say no was not only ineffective but completely a failure. That actually, what you just said, implies that no, it did hold things down a little bit.
Yeah, I think it accomplished both things, and I'm not hedging here, Eric. On one hand, people who wanted to use drugs, say a young person whose other friends have used drugs and doesn't want to be ostracized, might go, well, I want to be part of the group. But that whole message of Nancy Reagan and that, I think that it had a dampening effect on people who weren't in the drug culture and were thinking twice about it.
So it did prevent some from starting, maybe.
Yeah, but of course, the flip is also true. By the way, there have been a couple of really interesting documentaries about Roy Cohn and the Blacklist under Joe McCarthy. And one of these movies, I think you can get it on Netflix, is called Where's My Roy Cohn? And the most startling
with Trump's tie-in?
Yeah, Trump's tie-in, but also there's a Reagan tie-in. Roy Cohn contracted AIDS and denied it, even though he was far right, he was gay and he was in the closet. And Ronald Reagan, remember, no funding for AIDS. It was like, hey, you're on your own with this quote unquote gay cancer. Ronald Reagan helped get Roy Cohn into an experimental AIDS clinic in Florida when he was dying, because Cohn and Reagan were close. So on one hand, Reagan had this persona about, AIDS, we're not going to have anything to do with it, and yet he was helping the guy who had his same political ambition and outlook get into.
It's not surprising.
Which, of course,
everybody's complex.
Did not help him, and Cohn still died of AIDS.
Yeah, well, I mean, back then it was a death sentence. I mean,
yeah,
it was pretty much AIDS, you were gone. That's why it was so frightening. Get some more questions in here. Hey, Brad, do you think Hollywood is more of a cesspool now than it was then?
My parents were both Jewish, and I was not very religious. And I would shock my parents as a young man when they talk about, the Jewish state Israel, and they talk about being a Jew in the United States. And I'd say to them, look, I'm not interested in pursuing the religion. I think all religions are valid as long as you are open-minded about other people. But I told my parents, some of the worst people I have met in show business are Jewish people who tried to rip me off as a fellow Jew. Doesn't mean that only Jews, I'm not a self-loathing Jew. The fact of the matter is, the best way I can answer this is show business, the entertainment industry, gives people power who don't know what they're doing. But even though they don't know what they're doing, they can make unreasonable demands. And there are a lot of fast and loose rules. And people don't abide by contracts. People stab each other in the back. I suppose that exists in all industries. All I'm saying is, in show business, there's more of it than any other industry that's governed by rules and regulations.
Well, it's funny you mentioned, the Jewish background and being screwed over by Jews. I don't know if you know this, but in every, I'll call it a inbound group or whatever, Mormons are a good example, but there are serious problems with affiliation scams and cons because people of a group tend to trust other people in said group, and that is some fine pickings for a con person.
Yeah.
And that's why you'd be surprised how many scams go on in, like, let's say Salt Lake City or other places where you have a lot of people who are of one particular group. So it's not completely surprising. And a lot of people hang out.
I mean, just recently, I had a situation with, I can't get into the names, but a woman whose brother was murdered, okay? And a very high profile case. And they came to me and said, we want you to basically co-write the book. And, there's documentary possibility. And my relationship with the woman whose brother had been killed was good. But then I had to talk to her agent, who was verbally abusive to me and basically blew up a deal that I had with the woman. So, and he wasn't Jewish, and he was horrible. He was not only incompetent because he didn't serve the needs of his client, but he was rude and unprofessional in the way he dealt with me. And I went back to her and I said, you've been nothing but great to me, but unless we can negotiate with someone else, this guy is unprofessional. And I explained why I said that. And she was very even-tempered and said, but he's been helping the family and I have to work with him. And I said, okay, well, I wish you luck. Goodbye. So again, it's kind of still the Wild West. It's an industry where people can suddenly become advanced in terms of their position of power. It doesn't mean that their mores are advanced.
Well, I mean, it's very much a subjective system where there's a lot of free and loose money and titles and different things like that. It's not like, I'm not going to say I love corporations, but there are certain rules. There's job positions, there's different things in a corporation, and you're kind of limited. Whereas where you are, well, somebody's putting up a bunch of money for a movie and different people. I mean, for example, what the hell is a producer? because a producer can mean anything from the actors just putting their name on it so they can get an executive producer credit, to somebody who actually runs around and does work,
Right.
to somebody else who is a line producer. So I know that there's the writing room. What was it? I had Kevin Kelton on. He told me there are two writers. There's a showrunner and there's everybody else.
Right.
It's kind of a weird
Yeah.
field.
Yeah. A line producer is someone who looks over budget lines and talks about money. An associate producer can be the manager of a big star who goes, you can't have my star in your project unless you make me a producer. And they so need the star that they go, okay, he's number 11 of all the producers on the project.
Which has to hurt, because there's somebody who's got a title of producer who's actually running their ass off.
There you go.
Getting everything done for the director and stuff. And then somebody else who has the exact same title on the credits who does nothing.
This is so. And for a second there, you were talking about, we were talking about elevation of power. And when you come into money, it sometimes changes you. Well, one of the revolutionaries I wanted to talk to you about, Eric, is a guy named Jerry Rubin, who along with Abbie Hoffman was part of the Yippies. Okay. Their attitude was political change is not going to happen. They were actually extremely negative, but they were playful. So let's go and pretend to levitate the Pentagon, and let's throw dollar bills onto the floor.
Ask a dumb question before you get too deep in that.
Yeah.
What is the difference between a yippie and a hippie? And that's because I'm young. I think it's a good baseline to know. Might be a dumb question.
The Yippies were an organization that was co-founded by Hoffman and Rubin and my good pal Paul Krasner, who passed away not too long ago. And they were into street theater. They were into theatrics, where they would show up and have a demonstration, but not sort of holding up signs. They would like dress in costumes or do outrageous things and then run away before they could get arrested. Hippiedom, I think.
They are pranksters almost?
Yes, they were very good. They were pranksters.
And what we call a troll now. Possibly.
Yeah, like Ken Kesey's Merry Pranksters. Well, I think the Yippies were something like that. And Jerry Rubin was one of those people. And interestingly, he became basically a consumerist. He became an advocate of big business. He believed that you could not change America for the better because they didn't end the war in Vietnam. They didn't end racism. They didn't end a lot of the things that they stood for. And some of the members of the Yippies, like Paul Krasner, continued the rest of his life to be a writer and a comedian and kind of poke fun. Jerry Rubin goes into multi-level marketing and becomes a multimillionaire. So
he became a yuppie.
Yeah, you could say. I mean, I don't know what the definition of a yuppie is. Is it just somebody who's young and worships money over all things? I don't know.
I kind of feel like the yuppie is sort of like the label that the Xers, my generation, put on the boomers to say, you freaking hypocrites, look at you now.
So I had this bizarre occurrence. I was speaking after a book of mine was published, and there were 3 authors speaking to a crowd here in Los Angeles. One of the guys on the panel was Jerry Rubin, and he was wearing a pinstripe suit, and his hair was cut very, very short. The beard that he had was gone. Whenever I think of Jerry Rubin and the Yippies, I think of face paint and feathers sticking out of a headband, right? So before we began the panel, one of the organizers goes, "Oh, Brad, we want you to meet Jerry Rubin." And I shake his hand, and the first thing out of my mouth was, oh, right. I'm sorry, I didn't recognize you without the face paint. And he sort of gave me one of these, yeah, that's real funny. And then when he spoke, everything he spoke about was how to make money. He made no reference whatsoever to what happened in the 60s and the ideals of the people who wanted to make the world better. And I was kind of shocked. Abbie Hoffman, of course, became bipolar and took his own life. But I think that Abbie Hoffman's journey was seeing that he couldn't accomplish the things he wanted to, and he grew very depressed, especially, by the way, back to the Reagan 80s. I think by the time the Reagan 80s rolled around, Abbie Hoffman was miserable. He was close to his mother. She died. And of course, you know, his ideals had gone by the wayside. And I think that all contributed with bipolar to his taking 150 of those pills.
Looks like somebody agrees with my statement about yuppies. I'm a boomer. We hated them too. All about BMW and black leather driving gloves. All about money.
Well, look, the great thing about the capitalist society in America is if you're smart, you can make as much money as you want, more money than you ever dreamed of. And that's why we have so many billionaires. But then you have to sort of look at, and the pandemic is giving us this conundrum and forcing us to think about it. What do you do when society needs a safety net? And the government is generally not in the habit of bailing out the public to the tune of billions of dollars. What happens to capitalism? What happens to the gross national product? And how can those two things coexist so that people can still become fabulously wealthy in a free market economy and not have people working 2 jobs and sleeping in a car? And nobody's got an answer to that, but we need to figure that out now.
Well, all definitely true. And unfortunately, we're figuring out behind the 8 ball. Got a few more questions I want to try to tie in. So it might be a little all over the map.
All right.
This came in from the community before. Oh. Interesting. Yeah, YouTube didn't like me pasting that. So I'm just going to ask it.
All right.
Why is it that a large percentage of the most evil killers come from the West Coast?
They do? What about Ed Gein in Wisconsin? You know?
True.
What about Dahmer? Didn't Dahmer come from Milwaukee? What is it with Wisconsin? It's something in the cheese, I guess. I'm not sure. So
there are
West Coast. Okay. Manson and his family were a real aberration in 1969. Not that they killed someone famous so much as the brutality of the crimes.
Well, I mean, I think they're talking about going further than that. Green River Killer, Seattle, Ted Bundy, Golden State, Richard Ramirez, Ed Kemper, down the line. There's a few.
Yeah, I guess I was being overly defensive because I'm a Californian. I would guess that one of the reasons is that people migrate to California from all over the country. A land of opportunity. Sometimes people arrive here and they find out there is no opportunity for them. This may seem kind of strange, Eric, but I think this makes some sense in answering that question. I remember long ago finding out that Los Angeles was the bank robbery capital of the world. And at first I went, why should that be? And I realized that there are so many highways that people can get in their car, hit a bank, and maybe zoom from one highway to another before the police can visually follow them. So if California is a center for a lot of criminals, maybe there is some kind of freedom. Oh, California, he's weird, but he's just another wacko guy, and you find out the guy is a murderer. California has a reputation as being free and open, and maybe that brings in people we would rather not have.
Well, I would think of the California being the last of the West, personally. And people go to California. So it's probably a good playground to find victims, to find people who are a little more susceptible for your BS.
Yeah.
People who don't have any family or history or things like that. So it's, I do think I'm not blaming the victim, but a lot of times really killers are just opportunistic. So where can you find, like you say, more gullible people or more desperate people?
Yeah. Well,
than California?
This brings us back to Manson in a way. Manson had this phenomenal ability to go to wayward girls and, tell them how beautiful they were and be reassuring to them the charm of Manson really existed. You know, no matter how crazy he was, he had a side of him that he learned to turn on and charm people. And that's why he got close to people like Sharon Tate. And that's why he got these girls to basically have sex with him and anyone else he asked them to, because he gave them some positive reinforcement that they desperately needed. Weirdly enough, when Charlie left the San Francisco Bay Area because he'd burned some people on drugs and came down to LA, one of the first things he did, Eric, was he started being a sidewalk recruiter for Scientology on Hollywood Boulevard. Can you imagine Charles Manson coming up to you on Hollywood Boulevard and saying, "Hey, you look kind of down today. You know what? Let me tell you something. You're a beautiful person. I think that we can help you." I mean, he worked not very long, for maybe a week. But
I can totally believe it.
Paul Krasner actually found the records, you know, that Manson had worked for Scientology. And he was a manipulator. And that's how he convinced a lot of people to come into that community. And then by the time they moved in, you're out, you know, you're out on the Barker Ranch or wherever the heck you are. You're, you know, 70, 80 miles from the city. You have no transportation. And you're in a cult. It's basically a group that's a cult. And if all of a sudden you go, well, I don't want to have sex with that guy, or I don't want to do drugs, where are you going to go? And the flip side is true. You're also getting something warm and supportive in a life where you've been abandoned. A lot of these girls basically had terrible relationships with their fathers. And so Manson was an expert at manipulating people who were weak. And maybe there's something about that California culture of, we're very open-minded, and there are all kinds of people that entices some of those more damaged people to do business here.
Well, fantastic. On that happy note, we're past an hour already.
Out of anybody. There are too many people in LA, so, you know, please don't move here. We're trying to get rid of people.
No, stay.
Are jammed.
Stay. I don't want them.
I love you all. Just stay where you are. It's a lot quieter. I got airplanes flying over my house every day. And
I heard there's upper speakers that said when you leave, take someone with you.
Yeah. I remember the poster that a lot of Californians were moving to Oregon, and they put up signs that said, "Don't Californicate Oregon." So
and then you have the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Well, Brett, this has been fabulous. What do you have coming up?
Well, I can't even mention the project, but I think it looks very good that I'm going to co-write a book, and it has to do with policing and race with a New York Times #1 bestseller. I'm also working on a memoir based on my early 20s that was very outrageous and out of control. And actually, as soon as we get a handle on COVID-19, I look forward to doing the bus tours on the SLA and Manson again. We may just do webinars online until such time as it's safe.
Please do. That would be fantastic.
So I appreciate, as always, talking with you, and invite people to visit bradschreiber.com and tell me I think all you people in California are nuts. It's okay. We'll have a discussion about it.
Sounds fabulous. Brad, thank you so much for coming on. And
really appreciate
everybody, thank you for watching. If you like it, make sure you hit subscribe. I got to plug myself. I need to get better at it. Tell a friend, hit subscribe, hit the bell, please.